journal this week, I had a few thoughts, starting with Coontz chapter 11. I learned that marriage kind of had a mind of its own. There was a loosening of divorce laws throughout the United States and Western Europe, and to them, a loveless union was immoral and not to be dissolved without dishonor. Coontz, page 80. And in the 1950s, women's rights were increased, which led to increased marriage reform, and where we saw the increase in the loosening of divorce laws, which I thought was super interesting. And in the early 19th century, this is when we started to see the rise in the LGBTQ movement. And so it was kind of like we got to see the rise in women's rights, we got to see the rise in people's rights. And this led to marriage reform overall. So I thought that was interesting. The need for economic security tempered many of Victorian women's romantic dreams, as Coontz says in page 185. And I thought this phrase was just really interesting because we're talking about love marriages. We're kind of like transitioning past Pride and Prejudice's, Charlotte Lucas's focus on I need to marry for security. But this chapter is saying, hold up, we are kind of past that, but it's still a factor. Like, we can't discount it. It's still tempered it. We have loosening. We have more general acceptance. We have women's rights. But hold up. There is still a factor playing in here. So I just thought that quote was really interesting for me. I also thought another thing that was interesting was the man must provide or lose manhood. Coontz alludes to this on page 188. And I think that this it describes the gender roles of the time and why it was so important that the male breadwinner families existed. I also just think it was super weird, kind of the whole they needed people to believe that it went so far the other way that sex was bad, that they had to bring it back the other direction, that sex was good. And I was like, oh, that was a whole thing that we're kind of on the other side of in my generation, and I just kind of forgot that we had that whole pendulum swing during that time. So I thought that was really interesting. Finally, this last quote: when women finally got the right to vote in England after World War I, the editor of the Sunday Review called it a form of treason. That's Coontz, page 194. And I think that this kind of ties back into more of the gender roles of the chapter that it touched on in the Victorian era. But it's really interesting to me how, even though there was progression during this era, there was definitely still persecution. And there was still a slow change. It was like moving a cruise ship. Now touching on the yellow wallpaper, I'm not gonna lie, this story was really weird to me. I had a lot of thoughts while reading it. One of my first thoughts was is she being poisoned by the wallpaper? I've read about this arsenic green, people used to put green in their wallpaper and it used to poison them and they used to go mad and then they used to get air. I was like, is she getting poisoned? But then as I read on, I was like, oh, she just had a child, maybe it's postpartum depression. But I don't know, that wallpaper was doing something crazy to her. And then towards the end she started to identify with the wallpaper, and then I was like, did she murder her husband or did she just faint? Or I'm so confused why she threw the key out the window first and then made him go grab it. I don't know. I also think it was really weird how the doctor, there's this whole spot in it where her husband is can you not trust me as a physician when I tell you so? Discounting her opinion of her own mental health because he's a doctor and he must know better, and they don't believe what she's telling them. And obviously they've never given birth, they've never experienced maybe postpartum depression, which is maybe what is making her do this. And I just think that's crazy that nobody's believing her, and she's literally going insane. She's like, I need to get out of this room, and they won't believe her, and they're like, well, we're doctors, so believe us. And I just thought that was kind of crazy and insane. But also this whole story was a little confusing, so I might be misinterpreting it. And then for the story of an hour, this one was really interesting. It was short, and I thought it was crazy how, I don't know, it almost seemed like she came from it almost implied this woman came from a loveless marriage. She was told her husband died, and then she like just experienced this euphoria almost of, oh my gosh, I'm free, I'm not in chains anymore, look at all these things. And then her husband walked through the door and she was just like and then she died, because all those thoughts just were gone away. But then there was this whole like, there's a lot of implied messages here, because then there's this other family friend who came with them, Richard, and I don't know why he was there, but he kind of seems like maybe he was doing something with her. But Josephine seems nice. So I don't know, there's just a lot like that could be unpacked here. There's a lot like I could infer from this story, but not necessarily that was implied. So I think it's really interesting how this like touches on the theme of Victorian marriages, that maybe they looked better on the outside than they were on the inside. There was a lot of flaws on the inside. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I was a little confused by some of the things. I was surprised by some of the things overall.